Welcome, everyone, to another installment of the Political Field podcast. My name is Matthew Field, and that means you're watching the Political Field. If you've been paying attention to the news at all recently, or if you've been on the streets of Twitter, you would see the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter. And that is what we are here to talk about today. We are here to unpack what is going on in the country and explain some of the history as to why this is happening and what we as South Africans can do about our neighbors up north. I am joined by one of my peers from the University of Cape Town, Zviko Nyika. He is studying law and politics with me, so I see him in the law faculty. But more than that, he is an active member in Zimbabwe's politics. He is an activist since the age of 16, and he is the co-founder of one of the most progressive youth movements in the country called Create Zimbabwe. So Zviko, maybe we can start by you just explaining a bit more about yourself and then just breaking down what is going on in Zimbabwe. And what is this hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter?
Good afternoon to everyone. Still morning. Good morning to everyone. I'm a 22-year-old Zimbabwean with the Zimbabwean Dream. You know, we strive to see a better Zimbabwe, and our country has, it's been tough for the past 20 or so years. It's very quite unfortunate that we were born within that period where things tightened up and got tough. I'm an active citizen. I've been part of a few political movements, and I've been within the space and seen what's happened, I'm an average citizen who has a dream to be in a better Zimbabwe.
So maybe could you just break down what is happening right now? What is this hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter, and why are we seeing these massive protests in the country? And we've heard horrific stories about police brutality and brutality from the military. Can you just unpack a bit of what's been happening in recent days?
So what you have in Zimbabwe is a human rights crisis, and we have a shrinking democratic space. What you find is that there's a clampdown on dissent. We have a large economic meltdown. 7.7 million people in Zimbabwe are food insecure, and that's more than half the population. Zimbabwe has a population of about 16 million, just about 16 million. And given the worsening economic situation, a lot of people have been voicing out corruption, mismanagement of the economy, and hence that has brought tension between citizens and the government. So obviously, if you've been following the news, 2 years ago when Mugabe was disposed, it was a lot of people, there is some discussion to whether it was a coup or not, but definitely what we do know is that the military has had a very active role in Zimbabwean politics ever since then. And from that point onwards, you've seen the military, taking an active role in terms of pushing out protesters, shooting down citizens. We've seen rapes happening, tortures, abductions, and the persecution it's been quite ridiculous. But what you do find is that the opposition has been given very, very minimal space to speak about these things. And even neutral journalists who do not have political views, they say, you may call up political, have been sent to prison. One example being Hopo Chinono, who right now is languishing in prison for around about 3 weeks now. And he exposed a corruption scandal known as the RBZ, the Zimbabwe Reserve Bank, gave out a mechanization scheme in the late 2000s. And these were basically loans given out to the Zimbabwean elite and top bureaucrats. And these loans were totaling hundreds of millions of dollars and were never returned. Exposing such and getting the treatment of imprisonment illustrates to you that the democratic space has shrunk. And testament to what was reviewed also was that the people, we have a highly compromised judiciary. So you find some of the judges who are hearing some of these cases, they are also implicated in some of those cases. The incumbent president is on that list also. Top-ranking bureaucrats are also on that list, and several ministers are also there. So you do find that we do have a state capture, and it's quite unfortunate.
State capture is obviously a word familiar to many South Africans. So perhaps, our problems might be to a lesser extent, but there's a certain level of understanding that I think South Africans can have with this idea of government plundering. One thing I'd like to know is that there's always been this idea that Zimbabwe has struggled with, having a democratic space and with corruption and, free and fair elections. So is this what's happening in 2020 part of the norm, or is it something fundamentally different? And do you think there's a potential for real change to happen now in this space?
Yeah, I think it's a grassroots issue. Zimbabwe has struggled with human rights from the very beginning, and to be honest, I am one of the most optimistic citizens. But if I was going to give a fair answer, I don't think there's any chance, or rather hope, as to whether the human rights landscape will change. I think particularly one of the reasons why is the involvement of the military. So when you have a military state, it becomes very difficult for you to voice out your concerns. So in the long term and short term, if there is no compromise between the ruling parties on the PF and the opposition, and particularly also the citizens, also, I really don't see if we can get to a point where the Zimbabwe situation could be solved. I think one of the issues is also that there's a history of mistrust between the opposition and ZANU-PF. They were in a government national unity from 2009 to 2018, and that experience also stands as a stumbling block as to anything new coming between the two groups. So I think that history of mistrust and the heightening of human rights abuses really does come as a stumbling block to any resolution.
It's said that you can't create something from nothing, and so the deep problems that the Zimbabwean state finds itself now obviously have been around for decades. So I'm thinking, can we start at the beginning where you think that these problems started in the 1980s with the Gukurahundi genocide, with the establishment of this one-party state, and then going into the 90s? Can you just give us a brief overview of, where did Zimbabwe's problems really start?
So you find that Zimbabwe at independence, to be honest, Zimbabwe was the crown jewel of the African continent, and when the Rhodesians, I'll take you back a little bit. When the Rhodesians in 1965 decided to declare unilateral independence from the Brits, you find that they then built one of the most diversified economies by 1980. So Zimbabwe, unlike other African countries, had a very sophisticated and diversified economy, a robust infrastructure. So Zimbabwe had all the components for a success story. And I think from 1980 to 1990, relatively things okay. So what you find at independence is Mugabe tried to bring in everyone. Definitely have to commend him for that. But you find that by 1983, there was growing dissent between because ZANU-PF today is an amalgamation of two parties, ZANU and ZAPU. So you find those two revolutionary groups, there were skirmishes within even military camps when the military was consolidated, within government also, and within citizens, because Zimbabwe also does have an ethnic divide between Shonas and Ehlers. So I think that pushed towards a one-party state, and also I think history of mistrust between the two parties then led to a genocide. So you had roughly, the numbers are not known, roughly as many as 20,000 people were murdered in Matabeleland, where there were groups of dissidents, surely, that were targeting tourists and government structure. But I think the response from the government was inappropriate. A whole brigade was unleashed on a whole population, and what we found there was mass murders, mass rapes. Some people were murdered alive. I mean, some people were buried alive. Some people were burnt in huts. To this day, it stands as a mark on the Zimbabwean story, and something that we've never overcome in terms of trying to build that national identity and bond together as a nation, because it's something that has never been addressed. The incumbent president at that point in time was the Minister of State Security, and he is on record mentioning that the dissidents and the like are cockroaches. And I think what scares people right now is the sort of rhetoric that he's also now using. Recently, when he did mention that all these dark forces will be flushed out of the nation. You only said that this last week, and I think that sort of rhetoric now worries people that this is the same administration, or rather the core that was running the country in the early 1980s, that is now at the very top. So so I think a lot of people are concerned that this could only get worse as there is precedent by the Kukurawindi massacre.
So do you think that, it's likely for history to repeat itself, that, the same president who's in power now, who was responsible for this genocide, and might I say this genocide that hasn't even been taught in at least South African schools where it should be, because it's something that happened in a neighboring country. Do you think it's likely that that sort of gross use of violence could be used against the majority of the citizenry in Zimbabwe now?
I think it is very possible, and I think we've been through phases where there've been other acts of grotesque abuses of human rights and political killings that have happened over the years. I think now we really do stand at a point where it could massively blow up, and I think only recently in 2018, protesters went out protesting the election results before they were even out, because people were worried that it had taken slightly more than normal period for results to be announced. People went out the streets and protested, and of course there was a bit of vandalism, but it didn't match the response that came. The military came out and shot innocent civilians in the middle of the CBD. I think, to put this into context, I think in South Africa that would be the equivalent of the military, coming into the streets of Sandton, shooting people down in Sandton, or in the CBD of Joburg. And I think that's it's utterly ridiculous. And the people that are in command now really do not know proportional response to descent of war. Yeah.
So there's been a long history of questioning of elections in Zimbabwe. Like the late 2000s, early 2010s, there was a very contentious election. And, as Zimbabwe moved in its independence, we saw this emergence of the movement of democratic change. And so could you maybe just give us a discussion about the history of that movement and the role that it's been playing in Zimbabwe in the past, the role it's been playing now, and maybe just tying that into some of the elections that have been called into question in the country?
So the movement of democratic change was born in 1999. They came after a very tough period, not necessarily a tough period in Zimbabwean history, because there was a series of droughts and the economy had stagnated after the structure adjustment plans of 1990s, the Democratic Party came with a different voice. There'd never been a credible alternative in Zimbabwean politics, because up until I think 1999, ZANU-PF was the de facto state. So I think there's always been that intertwining between ZANU-PF and the state. Hence I said it's tantamount to a capture. And the MDC came at a crucial time when ZANU-PF was about to roll out a referendum on a new constitution. And the MDC, campaigned for no, and Mugabe performed dismally in that referendum. So the referendum had some of the things, such as the famous land reform program, expropriating land without compensation. I think something that you guys are about to battle with soon. Mugabe lost that referendum. And fast forward to 2002, where you then had elections. Mugabe, it is rumored that Mugabe lost, but there was a long contestation as to what happened, and there was electoral fraud. Truth be told, I think a lot of people do believe Mugabe lost the election, but when someone has captured the state, I think it's very difficult for you to have that transition of power. And what came about after that was massive, voter repression. But I think 2002 wasn't as bad as 2008, and I think 2008 was probably the worst. I think any Zimbabwean, if you ask them as to what period was life the toughest, I think it's 2008. I think also now in 2020 we're about to get there also, if we haven't already. In 2008 you had Mugabe lost the election, that is known. Morgan Changai had 47%, and Robert Mugabe had 43% of the vote. But the surprising thing is that electoral results took a month to release, and in between this month there was, killings, political killings. People were murdered. People's hands were dismembered, bodies were dismembered, and a lot of things happened. And I think 2008 also does stand as one of those points that when we do look back at history and the new Zimbabwe as one of those, and it's one of our lowest points in terms of the respect of human rights. So there's always been post-electoral violence in this country, and I think I think 2018 was I think 2018 at least was the year where we didn't have as much post-electoral violence, and I think that was just a sign that citizens were tired in 2018. Because truth be told, Zimbabweans have been through a lot of pain, and it has become a standard feature that after every election there are political killings.
Mm. Of course, political violence and political instability isn't the only thing that is a problem for Zimbabwe. Perhaps equal to or bigger than that is the economic crisis that the country finds itself in. I read in the news the other day that hyperinflation has struck again in the country. And so maybe could you just describe what it is like to live in a country where hyperinflation is the reality, and what do you think has caused that? It's common for, especially in sort of right-wing media circles in South Africa, to blame Zimbabwe's land reform regime and other economic policies that came out of the Mugabe government for the economic collapse. So what do you think caused Zimbabwe's economic woes, and what is it like to live in a country where the currency is collapsing?
I think it's very tough because I think Professor Hank does mention that the Zimbabwean inflation has reached 800%, which is quite ridiculous. Today, I'll give an example. A pint of milk is probably the equivalent of $1, but in our own currency, that's about $90 or $80. And the average citizen doesn't earn that much, really. So there's a you've got one of those situations where prices are rising every day, and incomes are not rising steadily at the same time also. So there's a mismatch between what you're earning and the inflation. So that, I think that makes business very difficult. And I think given also the COVID-19 situation has made the situation extremely difficult. 95% of our population is unemployed. So that means that 95% of our population are in informal trading. And what the government has since done, since the emergence of COVID-19, is done a complete lockdown in terms of business. So that means a lot of people really don't have streams of income coming in. So it's extremely difficult for the average citizen right now to be living. And it is mentioned that 90% of our population does live under the poverty line. It is tantamount to an economic genocide too. Food insecurity is at its height. But if you do look back and look at what caused it, what are the problems, I think it's a combination of a lot of things. It'll be very difficult for us to narrow down to one thing. I think it'll be also really unfair for us to just pin it on one particular institution. But I think, obviously, without doubt, ZANU-PF does play the biggest role in destruction of our economy and destruction of Zimbabwean lives, without doubt. But like you did mention, that the South African right-wing media mention land reform. I think land reform definitely has contributed to food insecurity, to you know, sanctions also followed, which tightened Zimbabwe's credit lines, um, and but like I said, it's a combination of things. I think you'd have to have a long conversation as to what caused Zimbabwe's economic issues, but the biggest one being corruption and unclear.
One of the things that the current administration in Zimbabwe has been blaming for the current wave of unrest is foreign interference. So, as someone living in Zimbabwe and as someone who is active in the way that you are active, to what extent would you blame sanctions for the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy? And is there any merit to what the government is saying in terms of foreign interference being the cause of this unrest?
So there has been this myth on sanctions affecting the economy, sanctions hurting Zimbabwe. But I think if you're going to assess the impact of sanctions, they're not that massive. Given that, Zidera, which is the name of the program brought about by the American government to restrict Zimbabwe from accessing credit lines and banning certain individuals, from entering the United States, and also targeting their personal economic assets in the West. It doesn't necessarily affect the average Zimbabwean. So the government has brought about this narrative that sanctions have hampered economic growth, and of course Zimbabwe doesn't have access to credit lines, but it's not because America has vetoed us from getting assistance from the World Bank or the IMF or Paris Club, but it's mainly because Zimbabwe has large debts that it hasn't serviced. So Zimbabwe's principal debt was 2.2 billion in 2001, and today it stands at $5 billion. That is to the World Bank. But Zimbabwe also does owe other players like the Paris Club, and to my understanding, Zimbabwe's external debt stands at 8 billion today. So I think the government has always tried to say it's because of sanctions now we can get credit lines and we serve and get business going. But we have to pay back our debt first. And given a non-functional economy, there is no way to service that debt. So it's a merry-go-round trap. But there are mechanisms to try. There are mechanisms to get beyond a credit crunch. I think there is the HIPIC program, high impoverished program done by the World Bank, but our government is not keen for those kind of they're not keen for those kind of programs because they're so used to fiscal indiscipline, and that is one of the reasons that has led to the Zimbabwean issue, that our government, 80% of the Zimbabwean government's revenue goes towards salary, and the government spends more than what they earn. So what you've had now is a situation that the government has started drawing into citizens' account, hence has led to this credit crunch that is within the country. So I think sanctions and foreign interference is propaganda. It's a propaganda spin to try and detract the populace from the actual fundamental issues of corruption and government mismanagement of the fiscal economy. So yeah, I'd say foreign interference is tantamount to that.
So you've outlined, in terms of matters of budget and of money, the immense struggles that Zimbabwe has. To put it in a blunt and less formal way, the country's broke. So if you were a magical policymaker and you could, and you had a free hand to fix it, what should an ideal Zimbabwean government do to get out of this situation?
To fix the Zimbabwean economy, I think one has to be cognizant of the surrogate currency that is emerged within the economy. So what you find is that the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe basically was drawing from people's personal accounts because we had a multi-currency regime. So, people's personal balances were now being drawn, and the government was using it for their own personal expenditure, to pay the civil servants, and also ridiculous government spending. You find that government ministers would fly in business class to South Africa, multiple times, and that sort of lavish lifestyle, and then the big fiscal imbalance ballooned the government budget, and they're not able to live within their means. So Tendai Biti, who is perhaps the best finance minister we've had in Zimbabwe, he took over during the government of national unity in 2009, between 2009 and 2018. He basically mentioned that if you're ever going to have, his philosophy was simple: eat what you kill. So you have to spend what you have, and the Zimbabwean government has not been able to do that, and hence that has led to a massive fiscal imbalance. This has meant that the surrogate currency that they've brought in to try and resuscitate, or rather replenish people's balances, has seen the economy blow up. And what you've seen is that the bond note has been chasing the dollar all along. The dollar is a principal currency, and this bond note has no backing whatsoever. The Reserve Bank did claim that it had a loan from the African Development Bank covering it, but I think it's just an illustration of how state entities and state institutions have been captured by one institution to the point where even basic financial matters have been spun. So I think going forward now, I think anyone who's going to come in, be it the FTC or whoever is going to take over with the ZANU-PF, I think the way forward would have to be ring fencing the balances of that surrogate currency, and I think trying to boost production. I think one of Zimbabwe's issues is production. Zimbabwe is only operating at less than a third of our industrial capacity. Some people even say as much as 5% of our industrial capacity. We have a massive trade deficit, particularly in South Africa. We're a highly consumptive country with little production going on. So that means also, that money, that means you don't have any money coming in. So remittances have had to balance out the economy for a very, very long period. And over the course of the last year, Zimbabwe did receive $922 million from our diaspora, ranging from South Africa, the United States, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Australia. So I think a lot has to be changed. Obviously, I'm not an economist, but I do think whoever comes through has a massive problem to solve.
It is a massive problem indeed. And, given the proximity of Zimbabwe to South Africa and how integrated our two economies are, a Zimbabwean problem is a South African problem, and a Zimbabwean success is a South African success. So I think maybe we can start wrapping up our conversation by just hearing from you. What do you think South African citizens should do and can do to help fix the situation in Zimbabwe? And what should the South African government do? Because right now, the status quo is from the government, quiet diplomacy, and from the citizens, horrific xenophobia, and that doesn't achieve anything. And it won't help the Zimbabwean people, and by extension, it won't help South Africa. So South African citizens and South African government, what should we do?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, and I think, but yeah, like you said, a lot of these things are intertwined, and particularly with the economy-wise. With the economy, the South African, I think you guys recently just took out a massive loan of 4.5 billion from the IMF and the World Bank. I think now you guys also have to start thinking about a mass exodus from the Zimbabwean economy coming into South Africa, and that means we're going to plunge into your resources. So I think now the South African government has to make an active decision on trying to on trying to solve this matter. And I think Cyril Ramaphosa has to go hands-on and speak to Emmerson Mnangagwa. And I think the first thing has to be, speaking about the human rights crisis. Number two, the economy is a big thing for South Africa now, because, like I said, if it's not fixed, a lot of us will cross into the South African border, and xenophobia will continue. And I think from the South African citizens' perspective, I think all you guys can do, to be honest, at this point in time, is just sort of highlight what's been going on. Retweet these hashtags, speak out. Join other Zimbabweans who are going to the consulates and the embassies, protesting against the government. But to be honest, I think the most important person in this matrix is Cyril Ramaphosa, and I think quiet diplomacy hasn't worked. We saw a couple of Mbeki do that in 2008 when he had the government of national unity, and what you see is just a merry-go-round of, okay, let's solve this, and next year you have the same problem. So I think Cyril Ramaphosa has to be very robust with Mnangagwa, tell him that I think you have to fix the economy, you have to fix the human rights issues. But truth be told, I don't think he has the capacity to do that, and he has no incentive to do that, because for the Zimbabwean elite, things are right. The Zimbabwean elite, they go to university in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and sometimes South Africa. So I think their kids and their families don't feel the crunch that the average Zimbabwean does feel, and we do need a robust hand from Cyril Ramaphosa to try and solve this crisis.
It is a crisis, and let's just hope that our government will be brave enough to take a stand. On the point of bravery, I think, closing off, I must just also emphasize how brave it is for you to come on for this podcast, because this entire, I think it's around about like 45 minutes of our discussion has been criticizing the Zimbabwean government, and you are in Zimbabwe right now, and that is not a very, if you were a completely self-interested person, then that probably wouldn't be the best decision for you to make. So I just want to thank you so much for having the courage to come on for this podcast and to shed light on what's been happening in the country. And lastly, I'd also just like to use this opportunity to give a tribute to the citizens of Zimbabwe who are standing up to their government, which is flagrantly abusing their human rights and is throwing their economy down the toilet. So thank you so much, Zviko, for coming on for the podcast today. And for the audience, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to hear about the crisis that is going on in our neighbor country up north. And stay home if you can, and stay safe. Thanks, everyone. My name is Matthew Field, and you've been listening to the Political Field Podcast.